Hi everyone, this is Nia and today we're going to be painting a set of autumn leaves with the optional gold shimmer. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to sketch them and paint them one by one, so let's begin by going through the colors. Firstly, this is Yellow Ochre by Szmal, Sap Green by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, Mineral Violet by Holbein, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Terre Verte by Holbein, and Payne Bluish by Schmincke. And this is optional, but I'll also be using my Finetech gold palette. I'll just be using those two colors in the middle. So let's begin by drawing out the first leaf. I always like to start with the midrib of the leaf just so I know the center. As for this one, I start at the top. I like to create 2 points for each tip and just one at the bottom. I want the tip to be a bit larger at the top in terms of the overall size and smaller as it gets towards the bottom. I'm going to start with 3 colors for this one. I'm using Hansa Yellow Medium, Vermilion, and Quin Sienna. I like to mix 3 separate colors on my palette just so I have easy access. I mix Vermilion and Hansa Yellow Medium to create an orange, and I also like to make 2 tones of orange, so for the lighter one I just added more Hansa Yellow Medium in the ratio. The Quin Sienna is also very orangey, but it has more of a brown tone, so I like to keep that separate. To paint this, I like to switch between colors. I begin by using the lighter orange, and I'm not waiting for each part to dry, but while I leave out some space, I like to continue with other darker colors like the Quin Sienna or the darker orange. This way the colors will mingle with each other and it creates a natural transition. For most of the leaves, I'm not going to be layering on more colors on top or too much colors on top, so I'll be using a medium to thick consistency to keep the colors nice and vibrant straight away. While working on the wet surface, I do make sure that the paper isn't puddling wet, so it's just damp with the paint and it's sort of evenly distributed. As for the top section here, I use a very thick consistency of Quin Sienna and I just pull the excess downwards while the rest of the leaf is still fairly damp. And as you can see, even if I pull the color downwards in a very thick consistency, the color is just going to spread ever so lightly, and it creates this really nice soft detail. For the stem of the leaf, I use a thick consistency of burnt umber, and I make sure that the bottom of the leaf is still a little bit damp. This way I find the stem will look more connected to the leaf, and I also decided to add this burnt umber to some of the edges of the leaf. Moving on to the second leaf now, it's the same concept, but instead of the 2 points, I'm just going to do 1 point for all of the tip of the leaves. This one is thinner overall, but I still want the bottom to be smaller than the top section. I'm going to be painting 2 of these facing the opposite direction, and if it's a bit difficult to sketch out or paint them facing the opposite direction, you can always flip your sketchbook. It's also up to you how you would like to compose your final painting, but I'll have the outline available in my coffee shop if you want the exact copy of what I'm painting right here. For this one, I'm going to be using yellow ochre and burnt umber. I'm going to be painting them with the same technique, so I'm not waiting for each section to dry, and I just like to alternate between the 2 colors. Personally, as a tip, I find it a bit easier to paint the edges first because of those sharp tips on the leaf, and then fill in the rest. As for the stem of the leaf, I'm just going to use a thick consistency of burnt umber, just like the previous leaf before, and I somehow tried to connect the burnt umber with the leaf at the same time. For the second one, I decided to add a bit of the orange mix with the yellow ochre just so the color is a bit more vibrant, and I also tried to paint this in a different approach. So instead of alternating the colors all at once, You can also paint using one base color, and while the surface is still wet, I follow it up with a slightly thicker consistency of burnt umber, and I just dot it around randomly. This way though, because the whole surface is already damp or wet, the added wet paint on top of that will travel a little bit more in comparison to the previous method. The next leaf is going to be a basic leaf shape with pointy edges. And to draw this out, I draw a basic leaf shape first, so this will act as a guide for me to draw on the points. I'm just going to paint a small one for this composition. I started by using a thick consistency of Terre Verte to paint the edges first. Then I'm going to follow this up by using a thinner consistency of yellow ochre for the middle section. And while the surface is still wet, I'm also going to add bits of burnt umber. For the stem of this leaf, I used Terre Verte mixed with burnt umber in a thick consistency. Let's move on to the fourth leaf now, where we'll be drawing a maple leaf. This one is a bit tricky. I like to begin by drawing out the skeleton or the ribs of the maple leaf. Then for the top 3 points, I'm going to create 2 curved lines each, with the middle one being the largest, so it has a larger portion compared to the ones on the right and left. As for the bottom, I made 1 point for the ribs, and then I continued on with smaller ones following up to the stem. You can also add more points on the curves that we drew out earlier and use that to act as guides. Again, I'm going to paint this one the same way as I did with the previous leaves. I started with Hansa yellow medium with a tiny bit of vermilion to create a deeper yellow. Then I follow it up with a bit of yellow ochre. For this one, I started with the lighter color and then I continued on with the edges using a medium to thick consistency of Quin Sienna. For an even darker brown, I also use a mix of Quin Sienna with burnt umber. Once I'm done painting the leaf, I'm going to continue on with the stem. While the surface of the leaf is still a little bit wet, I use a thick consistency of burnt umber to connect the stem to the leaf. Then, using a light load with whatever was left on my brush, I add on the ribs of the maple leaf. Next, I'm going to draw ginkgo leaves. This is one of my favorites. I like to begin by drawing out the center point first as the stem. Then I continue by adding S-curve shapes on both sides at the bottom, and I connect both sides, creating this fan shape. You can also draw out a basic fan shape as guide, and then draw on the uneven jagged edges. For the color, I'm going to use Hansa yellow medium with a little bit of whatever I've already mixed as orange on my palette to deepen the yellow further. Then I combine this by using a yellow-green mix from Sap Green and Hansa yellow. I'm going to use a similar color combination for the second one as well, but this time I'm going to apply it differently. I try to create this fan shape while trying to combine the yellow and the light green. And as for the edges, I follow it up by using an orange-brown mix that I already have on my palette. I also end up using the same orange-brown mix for the first ginkgo leaf as well because the surface is still wet, so I just dotted a little bit of this color around the edges. I'm also going to use the same color for the stem, and I'm using a thick consistency while the surface of the leaf is still wet to connect the stem and the leaf together. Next, I'm going to draw out dried thistles. Again, I start with the stem, then for the top I make this egg shape or oval, which I'm going to texture as I paint later. Then I finish it off with the spiky dried leaves underneath that I imagine grows out radially on the stem. For the color, I'm going to mix Terre Verde with a bit of burnt umber, and I create this spiky texture starting from the top going downwards, and as I move downwards I like to switch with more burnt umber so the color has more browns. As for the stems and the leaves, I'm going to use a mix of burnt umber with mineral violet to darken the brown further. When I'm painting the leaves, I like to take advantage of the point on my brush to create sharp tips, but you can also switch to a smaller brush if it's easier for you to make those leaf shapes. Just like the previous leaves that I've painted so far, I like to connect the top section with the stem, so while the surface is still wet, I also added this darker brown, so there's a slight transition between those three colors. Since the first thistle is fairly dark, for the second one I just used Terre Verde to paint on the spiky texture. Then while the surface is still wet, I follow it up by painting the leaves using the same mixture as before with burnt umber and mineral violet. Then as I paint the stem, I'm going to bring some of this brown color at the bottom of the thistle as well, so it still has a little bit of brown underneath. Next, I'm going to draw another type of maple leaf, and this one is fairly easy though. I start with a stem and a basic leaf shape, and I'm going to make another two basic leaf shapes on either side of the first one. These leaves will act as guide for me to draw the spiky edges, and for the bottom portion, I'm going to add a smaller basic leaf shape on either side, so it will still become a 5-pointed leaf. I want this maple leaf to be a dark red or somewhat like a burgundy color, so for this one I used a mix of vermilion with mineral violet, and I just play around with the ratio in order to get different tones of this red. It was a bit difficult for me to paint this one upside down, so I just turned my page around to make it easier for me to paint this one. So it's much easier for me to hold my brush in order to take advantage of the pointy tip. For this next one, I want to create an old dried twig with dried leaves. I also want to make the stem look very angled, so I just made sharp turns. Then I just add round tip leaves growing on either side. Since I want this one to look very old and dry, I used a very muted brown color by mixing burnt umber with Payne's Grey Bluish. For this next one, I also added yellow ochre just for a bit of variation in color. And at the bottom of each leaf, that's where I like to gather all the excess paint, so the bottom is slightly darker than the rest of the leaf. I used the exact same mix for the stem, which is from burnt umber and Payne's Grey Bluish, and I use a very thick consistency to paint the stem, and of course I connect it together to the leaves while the surface of the leaves are still a bit damp. Sometimes I like to also intentionally add this thicker consistency paint in order to darken the bottom of the leaves. So this next one is more like a dried flower. I started with the stem, which branches out into several sections, and whenever it branches out, I like to add tiny leaves. I also made tinier branches at the very top of each of those smaller branch, and that's where I'm going to place the small flowers. For the tiny flowers, I just draw teardrop shapes or ovals or circles. It doesn't really matter because it's going to be very tiny, and I like to draw and paint them later in clusters. For this one, I started by painting the stem first, which I used a mix of burnt umber, yellow ochre, and Payne's Grey Bluish to mute the brown. And I'm going to just use the same color to paint on the tiny leaves as well as the smaller branches. For the smaller branches, you can also switch to a smaller brush if it's a bit easier for you to create very thin lines. But the main trick is to keep a very light brush load even if you're using a thick consistency paint. This way the tip of your brush will stay nice and sharp. Once I've painted on a few of the smaller branches, I'm going to move on to paint the flowers, where I'm going to use the exact same color mixture, but in a very light consistency this time. This will give out a very muted creamy color, and I just use the tip of my brush with very light pressure to create those clusters of flowers. If you want the color to be more muted, you can add more Payne's Grey Bluish and less yellow ochre. The yellow ochre will give more warmth to this particular color, so you can play around with the ratio in order to get the tone that you like. And here I'm just going to repeat the same method to paint this smaller bunch of flowers. This next one is the repetition of the first leaf that we painted, but I made it a bit thinner, and I also switched the color so it's the same color that I used from the previous bunch of flowers, which is from yellow ochre, burnt umber, and Payne's Grey Bluish. I use a very light consistency for this, and I use a thick consistency of the same color for the stem. Moving along, this one is fairly simple. I'm just drawing out 3 stems, but these are going to be separate leaves. I just draw out a basic leaf shape for a guide, and I use the guide to create those pointy edges. The colors that I've chosen for this one is the burgundy mix from Mineral Violet and Vermilion, and I also pair this with a little bit of Terre Verte, which will turn into a brown tone when mixed with the burgundy. I'm just going to apply the paint the exact same way as I did with the previous leaves, and just like before, you can play with the ratio as well as the consistency of paint depending on the tonal value as well as the hue that you're looking for. Before I paint on the stems this time, I decided to use a mix of Payne's Grey Bluish with burnt umber to just add the color underneath. Then I continue on to paint the stem in a thick consistency. On to the next leaf. This one is going to be a really large and round leaf. This is going to be the guide, and then I'm going to add those sharp tips around the guide that I've drawn out earlier. For this one, I want to make those sharp tips fairly curved just to give it extra character, and because we have a large surface area, I'm going to make a distinct midrib as well as veins to this particular leaf. For the color, I decided to paint this one mostly with a yellow hue, so I used yellow ochre with Hansa yellow and a tiny bit of vermilion to warm up the yellow slightly, and I of course change up the ratio, so some parts are a bit more brown with the yellow ochre and other areas have more of the warm yellow color. At the bottom, I also decided to add an orange mix just for an added variation in color. I like to use the tip of my brush to sharpen the edges or the tips of this particular leaf and also make them curve slightly. Then while the surface is still wet, I also decided to add some darker browns so it looks like parts of this leaf is slowly drying out. For the brown mix, I use burnt umber with Payne's Grey Bluish, but if you want the brown to be more vibrant and less muted, you can mix it with Mineral Violet instead. I like to play around with the consistency of this brown as well, so as you can see around the edges, I use a thicker consistency where the brown is more distinct, and I like to also dot a lighter consistency in the middle portion of the leaves as well. If some of the edges of the brown look a little bit too sharp for your liking and you want to soften the edges but the surface has already dried out a little bit, you can also soften the edges by using a clean damp brush. For the stem, I just used the same brown mix, which is from Payne's Grey Bluish and burnt umber. Next is another dried flower. For this one, I made one main stem and a lot of smaller branches which fans out of that main stem. Then I'm going to draw tiny little flowers right at the top. I'm also going to add more flowers underneath just so it looks like it has somewhat of a radial placement from bird's eye view. For the stem, I used burnt umber, Payne's gray bluish, and a bit of mineral violet in a thick consistency. I'm using the tip of my brush in order to get those very fine lines. Just like the previous dried flowers or how I drew out the stems on the leaves, I would suggest for you to use a very light load on your brush so the tip of your brush stays nice and sharp. This also applies even if you're using a smaller brush than what I'm using right here. For the flowers on this, I use yellow ochre with burnt umber and Payne's gray bluish to create the same creamy color as the previous one. And of course, I use a very thin consistency just like before so the color stays nice and light. Next one is going to be berries. I painted this one already for a previous video where I made berry bookmarks. And for this one, it's up to you how many berries you want to make. I just want to make the odd of 3, and the berries are oval in shape. And I'm also going to paint dried leaves on top of these berries. I'm going to start by painting the dried leaves first, where I use a mix of Terre Verte with burnt umber. To paint the tiny leaves, I just use the pressure of my brush, so I use less pressure when I'm painting the tip, and I just put on more pressure as I paint the middle part of the leaf and pull until I reach the tip of my brush. I want to make the berries orange, so I use a mix of Hansa yellow and a little bit of vermilion. And as I paint this, I want to leave out some white highlights with just the negative space. And this simple highlight will make the berries look less flat and give it more of a round form. And just like the other leaves, for the stem, I use a mix of Payne's gray bluish and burnt umber in a thick consistency. This last one is just an additional flower that I decided to paint on to fill in an empty space. I just paint on simple petals, which is formed into a fan, so it looks like we're looking at the flower sideways, and I'm going to continue it with a green receptacle as well as a small stem. It's up to you what color you want to make this flower. For me, I just use the orange mix that I already have on my palette, and just as how I painted the smaller leaves on the berries, I just use the pressure on my brush to create the petals, and while the petals are still wet, I use Terre Verte to paint on the receptacle and the stem. The next step after this is just to paint on the details of the midribs and the veins of each of the leaves. So for this, I used whatever I have on my palette already, mostly the browns, but you can also mix up your own browns if you don't have any more colors left on your palette. I just use a thin consistency with a dry load using the very tip of my brush in order to create very fine and light details. I'm just going to do this for all of the large leaves, and you can also alter the color according to the base color of the leaf if you would like to. The ginkgo leaves are a bit different. In terms of the veins of the leaves, it's going to fan outwards, but I'm still going to treat it the same way by using a thin consistency in a dry light load. For this large round leaf, I made the veins curve outwards just to give it extra character, and since there's a lot of space on this one, I also decided to paint on finer veins, which branches out from the main veins, and I want to make sure that this detail is very subtle, so I use an even lighter consistency. For the thistles, as the paint dried, it also flattened this top portion, so I just decided to add a bit more of the texture on one side for added form. For the dried flowers, I used the same mix as before, which is from yellow ochre, burnt umber, and a little bit of Payne's gray bluish, and I just dot this color underneath the lighter petals. I'm also going to do the same for the second dried flowers. This one though, I didn't use yellow ochre, and I also made the detail a little bit finer, so I just used the tip of my brush to create fine lines. For the berries, I use a darker orange just to paint the sides, again because after the paint dries it will flatten it out, so this shadow will just add additional form. Now this part is completely optional and you can finish off here, but I just wanted to add a little bit of gold detail or shimmer in parts of the leaves. I just used these two colors. You can use one of them or combine them together. I just want to make sure I have a fairly thick consistency, so I activated these two colors with quite a lot of water that puddles in the middle of the palette for easy access. Then I just use a medium to thick consistency to paint some of the edges for added detail, or sometimes I like to go over the veins and the midrib as well. If I want a sheer coverage for a large portion of the leaf, I will use a thin consistency just to glaze over those areas. The reason why I decided to add this gold shimmer to the painting is because, well, for one, it's fun, and I also love the sparkle, but it's actually quite subtle that sometimes in even lighting the gold isn't visible, so it just looks like the original painting, but the shiny gold will show through if you're looking at this painting in certain angles and lighting, and I just love the idea of adding subtle decorative element. So I'm just going to continue adding the gold until I find that I have a good amount, and I hope you guys find it relaxing to watch this portion of the video since it's been quite a long one. So once I'm happy with the amount of gold, lastly, when I looked at the overall composition, I just felt like there's this empty space that I need to balance out, so I decided to add a tiny twig with added leaves with Terre, Verte, and burnt umber. So that's pretty much it for this painting. It's been such a ride editing and voiceovering this one because it's so long, but I hope you guys still enjoyed it nonetheless. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. The outline will also be available in my coffee shop. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!